Well, hi Tim. How are you?
Doing well, Scott.
Well,
How are you doing?
doing well. Thank you for
Good.
agreeing to be with me and answer 5 questions regarding leadership in the church. Before we get to some of those questions, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Uh, my name's Tim Gunnells. I'll say a few things. I'm an associate professor of Bible leadership and ministry at Amherst University in Montgomery, Alabama. If you don't know much about Amherst, we've got a 50-year history, but in the last 15 or so years, we've done everything online. We're a fully accredited, fully online uh, university. We have associate degrees all the way through several PhD programs, and it's an exciting time to be a part of the school there. But also a part of that is I get to work with a lot of different people, quite a diverse student population. And the flexibility of the job also allows me opportunity to go work with churches. And I do leadership development with churches, do some consulting, do mentoring with ministers. I'm actually a fourth generation, I would say fourth generation gospel preacher.
Yeah,
And that's actually a pretty cool thing that I
yeah,
appreciate more now that I'm nearing the mid-century mark of life. I appreciate that more than I once did. My dad, who's 80 years old, still preaches every week
right.
and also teaches for us. And he lives in my house.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got my wife, Kristen, and I. We're coming up on 25 years of marriage
Wow.
this year.
Yeah,
We've got 4 children, ages 17 down to 3,
wow.
and my parents live with us, and 2 dogs, and so we've got an active life. We live in East Tennessee now, work and worship with the Athens Church of Christ in Athens, Tennessee. I'm not on staff right now. I get to volunteer to do a lot of things, and I enjoy the church here, and I've also got a church in Arizona supporting me a little bit as far as going out and working with other churches.
Yeah,
So that's a nice thing.
yeah,
But been doing ministry in some form on in staff or otherwise since I was 18 years old. I've been working with churches, and I'm 48 right now, so
yeah.
I don't mind anybody knowing how old I am. But uh, I love working with leaders. That's really what I've focused on, and so that's what I enjoy really church leadership and developing leaders.
Yeah, so you probably learned a lot not only from your education but also your experience that you've been doing this since 18, you know.
Yeah, I definitely mix in a lot of experience, and I've been blessed to work with churches in different parts of the country, actually as a paid minister. And you see some different things if you're out west or if you're in the deep south, and even in the south, from state to state, from locale to locale, you'll see some different things. And each congregation has its own culture and own peculiar history. And I use peculiar in a fun way. And one of the things I've learned through experience more than even education is that you definitely can't go into a church setting and look at things the same way you did in the last church you were working in, or you were helping. And so the ability to be flexible, to realize you've got 2 ears and one mouth,
Yeah,
and listen, and you got 2 eyes too.
yeah,
In my case, I now have 4 eyes.
yeah,
I've got progressive lenses now, but I really try to look. I try to listen, and try to take in things. And uh, when I was 16 years old, I started teaching the junior high class at our my home congregation in South Carolina. And I was like, why are you having me teach the junior high class? And that's probably the greatest gift I was given as a young man, was to have to teach and learn to work with people, and learn about personalities. So experience definitely comes into play, and having my own mentors and coaches. I call on people when I know I don't have the answer, or if I feel a little stretched in some way. I've got folks that I call
yeah,
that are older and more mature than me, and I say, this is a new one. Can you help me with this? And that's been invaluable.
yeah. Well, when as we begin to talk about leadership, and you think about kind of leadership across the board, what's the difference between biblical leadership or spiritual leadership and business leadership or leadership that we see in the world?
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. And I teach a class called Spiritual Leadership at Amridge that is pretty neat in that it goes across about 7 different programs. And I have counseling students in there, I have business and leadership students in
Hmm.
there, and I have ministerial students in there. And on the graduate level, and I've actually had a lot of military officers in that class, and I've had people who are managers in their business, and then you've got people that are leaders of congregations. And I think when we think about biblical leadership or spiritual leadership, our first thought is church.
Yeah.
It's almost always church. It's a preacher, it's a minister, it's an elder, it's a deacon, and that's what we think. But I like to bring in a lot of resources that sort of turn that a little bit and talk more about spiritual influence.
Yeah.
And everybody really should be a leader. And I'll never forget the student that emailed me and said, "I can't answer this discussion post about spiritual leadership because I don't have a ministry context. I don't lead. I'm a single mother. I don't lead anybody."
Yeah.
And I said, "If you're not a leader, I don't know who a leader is.
Hmm.
If you are the primary influence of your children, you're definitely a leader. I mean, they are looking to you always." So, we could look at different things. Certainly, there are church leaders, and we might consider them biblical leaders or spiritual leaders in the truest, most pure definition.
Yeah.
But everybody really should be a leader or should recognize that they're a leader because somebody's watching. They're leading somebody. I think about my grandmother, who's been dead for many years, but examples of things she did even before I was born that I've heard, the stories I've heard, and then things I witnessed myself that she did with people. She never had a title. She obviously was never a church leader. She was really never had any title of any kind that said leader, manager, or anything.
Yeah.
But yet she's one of the greatest influences on my life, even to this day. So I would consider her to be a leader. Now, when I go work with churches, I don't work just with the church leaders, quote unquote. That is where I do most of the work, and that's where I spend most of my time. But a lot of what I'm doing is trying to help them cultivate leadership skills among the entire church. And I tell folks that are in business, you have opportunity to certainly be a spiritual leader in your company or your organization. Military leaders, yes, you may have a lot of restrictions that I don't have, in ministry, but you certainly can be an influence, be a spiritual influence, and most of them take that to heart.
Yeah. Good. Well, when you think about leadership, obviously there's some forms of leadership that are not healthy, what we
Right.
might even call toxic. Um, and I know you could probably say a lot about this, but maybe help us out a little bit. What is healthy leadership and what does it look like?
Healthy leadership is humble leadership. I think it starts there.
Yeah.
And if it ever leaves a point of humility, it's no longer a healthy leadership. You know, thinking back in my life experiences where I've seen leaders get off the rails, maybe churches go off track, and even I could even look at businesses and you see someone who's arrogant
Mm.
or self-centered, someone who thinks they have all the answers,
Yeah.
or they're not willing to listen or adapt. I know the word change sometimes scares people, so I like the word adapt maybe a
Yeah.
little bit more. We have to adapt as we get older. You know, some of us wear inserts in our shoes and glasses on our face, and
Mm-hmm.
now to walk better and see better as we get older. Churches have to make changes I think about going into a church that doesn't have any facilities for changing diapers. There's nothing in the bathroom. And I go into churches sometimes like, where's your changing station for your children? Well, we don't have any children. I said, well, there may be a reason you don't have any children.
Yeah.
You haven't even thought about children. You don't make any accommodations for anybody. Well, that goes to you. That goes to humility or arrogance or narcissism sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it's just ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance as an ugly word.
Sure.
It's just I'm not aware of things. I don't understand things. Maybe it's been so long since I was in that situation, I can't think about those things. But I'm also not willing to think about those things. So healthy leaders, in my mind, are always looking, always listening, always trying to understand. And the other thing is they're living the greatest commands.
Hmm.
They're loving the Lord with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and they're loving their neighbor as themselves. And it's an inside out leadership. Healthy leadership is always healthy inner life relationship with God that extends out into healthy external relationships.
Yeah.
And so healthy leadership to me is about relationships. It's about relationship with God first and relationship with others second. And it's love and humility and, concern for other people.
Yeah. When you think about healthy leadership, why is it essential for churches to have healthy leadership? In other words, maybe what can go wrong if they don't have healthy leadership?
Well, a few things can go wrong that come to my mind, and we see it in the New Testament with Diotrephes.
Hmm.
When the Apostle John addresses him, it is not uncommon, as my dad likes to say, to have a bell cow and an eldership. And you probably have to have been around cows to understand what that means. But I've had people ask me what do you mean by a bell cow? Well, you don't train every cow in the pasture to come in to the barn. Especially around here, we got a lot of dairy cows.
Yeah.
The bell cow is the one that's literally wearing. I don't think they do it as much anymore, but there was a time, especially in my grandfather's day, they literally wore a bell around their neck, and every other cow kind of followed the bell cow, and it was like you don't do anything without the bell cow having a say so in it as to where you go and so forth. And I've been in positions of leadership or with churches where maybe I talked to a group of elders, but one elder wasn't there, and then he came the next week, and it all changed. The entire conversation is like it didn't even happen because he wasn't there.
Yeah.
Because he had to sign off on everything, or he had to rubber stamp everything. And so unhealthy leaderships where there's maybe a dominant elder or a narcissistic elder or a minister can be that way.
Yeah.
A CEO could be that way, where they're so self-focused and they think they're the only ones with the answers. And Paul addresses this so well in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, the idea of spiritual giftedness, that we're all needed, we all have something to offer. And just imagine showing up at a church where there were no introverts and it was all extroverts, or showing up at a church where it was all introverts and no extroverts, or showing up at a church where it was all kind of slanted to one age or one occupation.
Yeah.
Or there weren't any women there.
Yeah.
It was that would be or there's no diversity of race or ethnicity. You go into some of those situations, and you need diversity, and you need diversity in leadership. And so part of having healthy leadership, I think, is having diversity of leadership, and gifts and skills and temperaments. But the main thing is, if people aren't spiritually grounded, if they're not spiritual leaders, if they don't put Christ first, if they don't esteem others better than themselves, like Paul says, you're not really leading people, you're ruling people.
Yeah.
And that's not the same thing. So healthy leaders are going to practice participatory leadership. They're going to listen to people. They're going to be concerned about people.
Yeah, that's great. Well, most ministers, most preachers are trained in some way. Some of them have a little bit of training. Some of them have a lot of training. When you think about elders, though, elders don't always receive training.
Right.
And so
very seldom.
Yeah. And so what can congregations be doing to train and equip elders?
Well, it probably depends on sort of where they are in their history
Mm-hmm.
and where they are with their current, if they have elders.
Yeah.
And I work with some churches that don't have elders, and they're just trying to establish elderships. Churches that are trying to establish elderships, you're going to want to do a lot of teaching about what a spiritual leader is and the characteristics of elders, and maybe put some things into their hands to read and have some seminars and that sort of thing. But if you have a situation where you have some well established, healthy elders, those elders are going to want to mentor men who are coming behind them.
Mm.
They're going to really want to spend some time with them, and not just in processes and how we sort of do things around here.
Yeah.
You're taking them on visits with you. You're doing Bible studies with them. You're putting them in positions to start leading now. I like to look at it as a continuum. You have uh, maybe four levels of leadership in a church. Level four may be somebody that goes out and does things in other places that helps other churches or sort of does across the country stuff. But in churches, level three leaders tend to be elders and ministers. Level two leaders are deacons or ministry leaders. And then level one leaders are people that are sort of task oriented. But then you got some people that aren't even on level one.
Yeah.
They're not doing. It's not that they're not doing anything, but they don't know what to do. And so really, elders and ministers have to go back to folks that are way over here, not even on the chart in some way, and start working with them at an early age. I think our young people, even when they're in elementary school, they need to understand more about what elders are. Elders need to be spending time with them. So it starts at a cultivating point. But then, let's say that you have an eldership that just says we don't know really what to do. We just feel overwhelmed. Uh, I recommend even just getting some books and start reading them together.
Yeah.
Just something as simple as, hey, what are some books that I can read that would benefit me as an eldership? One of the things I've done in places is just go through a book with an eldership, and I think that's where a minister should come in. A preacher should come in and say, I'm not trying to tell you how to do anything, but why don't we study together as a leadership? Books about church health or church
Yeah.
growth or leadership or shepherding or something like that, and just let's have a class ourselves for a quarter. It's for Sunday school, something like that. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But there are also a lot of folks like me who come and do workshops or who do ongoing consulting and coaching. I am not the only one out there. Thankfully, there's lots of folks that are more than happy to come do not just a weekend, but kind of start a conversation with people and see where that needs to progress.
Yeah. Well, speaking of books, just very quickly, kind of a follow up. Is there a specific book or two that you would recommend? Say, hey, here's something y'all might go through.
Um, there's a classic in Churches of Christ, in particular, Lynn Anderson's "They Smell Like Sheep." I
Yeah.
really don't think you can. I mean, it's good to always recommend that.
Yeah.
That's a great book. Um, I've actually found a really good book that was written more probably as a class by Harold Shank that's been out for several years called "It's All About God."
Okay.
Doesn't sound like a leadership book, but he does a few things in there. He looks at the life of E.H. Imes, who served as a he worked at Pepperdine, he worked at Lipscomb, he worked in ministry till he was 90 years old,
Yeah.
and um, also he worked with the Central Church in Nashville years ago, like during the Great Depression and afterwards. And he kind of shows that was a very healthy church.
Hmm.
E.H. Imes was a real healthy spiritual leader.
Yeah.
And then he kind of brings Moses in and uses Moses and Jesus as examples.
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful, easy book for churches to look at and go through. There's also a book that I've really come to enjoy called Redefining Leadership. And Joseph Stowell, Stowell, Joseph Stowell, that's the book he's written. I think that's a really great book that's easy to pick up and go through. And he talks about shepherds and deals with that. So those are three books I think are really really good.
Thanks. Your story is similar to mine in that at an early age, kind of put into a leadership position, and you look back at that, and I was probably a nervous wreck at the time and didn't know what I was doing. I mean, for a long time, I thought I didn't know what I was doing,
Right.
Um, and so, what can a congregation be doing to raise up those future leaders in the church?
One of the things that a congregation should do to raise up leaders is to go to them and say, "You are a leader," because people need to hear that.
Yeah.
And going back to also mentoring and modeling. Um, but I remember, and I tell this story a lot. There was this was in Elba, Alabama. This is a small town, 3,000 people, South Alabama.
Yeah.
My dad was preaching there, and I later preached there. Um, but there was a little, I call her a little widow lady. I don't have any other way to put it. She was about 5 feet tall, and she was a widow and a retired school teacher.
Yeah.
And she wasn't the friendliest person in the world, but every Sunday when I was a little boy, she'd come out and tell me, "You're going to make a great preacher one day."
Mm.
And believe it or not, she was the only person saying that to me.
Yeah.
She was the only person saying that to me, but it stuck with me. And then when I became a teenager and we lived in another place, there were two more ladies, not men, not elders, nobody else. There were two ladies in the church that would come to me and say, "You're going to be a great preacher one day. You're really going to make a difference." And then I decided, well, I guess that's what I got to do. That's who I'm supposed to be. So I think starting with just telling people, kind of thinking and praying for people and going to them and saying, you really, I know you're not there now. You may not think you're ever going to be there, but you have the potential to be a great elder in this church. And so get them thinking about it. But then putting them in positions to lead small groups, not throwing them into the to the deep water necessarily, but come alongside me. And you might think I'm only looking for people that are already in positions of leadership, and that's really short-sighted, because you're looking for the humble people, the what I would say biblically grounded people, people that are studying the Word themselves, the people that are already shepherding other people. They already have that propensity and that empathy and that compassion, and they're bold in their faith, not in an arrogant way, but they obviously are convicted.
Yeah.
Looking for those people, I think it starts there, and then going ahead and doing some regular leadership development. I help churches plan like an 18-month leadership development, program, curriculum. Let's just plan out 18 months.
Yeah.
And that could be a combination of reading books. There maybe is a retreat that you have in there. It could be that you go through doing some mentoring and saying, okay, now we're going to do some mentoring for the next 3 months. And every elder, you pick somebody else that you're going to spend time with, and let's just start working with them. Don't scare the people. It may be a 25-year-old guy in the congregation that an elder who's in his 60s goes to and says, "Hey, I want to start mentoring you now to be a leader in this church."
Yeah.
So I think being intentional, being thoughtful, actually planning is a big thing, and doing something. I think it's better to do something than to not do anything.
Yes.
That's probably my biggest advice for churches. Do something. Make
Yeah.
a plan. Have goals. Actually do something. Don't wait around. And I know a lot of churches, you come along and, I was with a church that I worked with as an intern 30 years ago. And at one time they had about 12 elders. Now they have 3 elders. And the church isn't that much smaller, but they haven't added to the eldership. And now they're sort of in desperation mode. Like, what are we going to do now?
Yeah.
Well, there were some things that needed to be happening all along the way. And so being intentional, being thoughtful, being prayerful. And I should have said that all the way through this.
Yeah.
Being people of prayer and modeling that. And I think current elders and everybody in the congregation ought to be praying for the church leadership now and in the future.
Yeah. Great. Well, Tim, I appreciate you joining me and discussing leadership, and we'll try to get some links up to those books. I know that people can follow you on Twitter, and so
yes,
kind of get some.
And that's the only place I am now.
Yeah, Twitter. I know you're kind of intentional about that.
At Timothy Gunnells. Yes.
Yeah, you're intentional about that, and that's wise in our day and age, I think.
Yes.
So thanks for joining me, and we'll have another video next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Scott.